This is Loving the Spectrum. If you're new to our channel, we put out videos once a week, generally on Fridays, but sometimes on the weekend, like now. We cover content based on our own experiences as queer non-binary autistics, and we make this content for other autistics, LGBTQ+ folks, and anyone else that's simply here to learn.
This means we are happy to interact with our audience members that are here to learn, but will ultimately prioritize the voices of those in our communities.
If this sounds like the place for you, then subscribe for more of our content.
Today's video will be about burnout, autistic burnout.
Yeah. So we don't have a script for today's video.
Surprise, surprise, because we're burnt out. We were sitting down trying to write one, and I almost had a meltdown because they tried to talk to me while I was looking at my computer, and I was like, it's too much!
So we decided
so we don't have a script. We have just vague,
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, we've generally been able to do a beginning intro script and then an ending script, but even just writing the middle chunks have been really hard.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this video is really gonna be kind of all over the place because that's pretty much how our brains work.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, especially being in burnout, stuff has been extra foggy and extra hard to think through.
Yeah.
I know for me, communication has always been one of my main skills, but also one of the things that's hardest hit when I'm burnt out. It gets really hard for me to communicate with people.
Because communication is oftentimes one of the things that comes the most from masking. Communicating in a neurotypical way, you're really, really good at it when you're completely charged up emotionally.
Yeah.
But as soon as you're burnt out, you have to communicate in ways that neurotypicals don't like.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a big part of why our videos are so rambly. We've gotten lots of people addressing that in the comments, some in negative ways. Yeah, I don't think I've seen it referenced in any positive ways, but it is an autistic trait to be rambling. So yeah.
And even in terms of editing, when you ramble and your thoughts jump the way we do, it's really hard to edit.
Mm-hmm.
When your
there's
thoughts
the whole
aren't coherent to
of
begin with, it's really hard to edit them to make them easier.
Yeah. And then just editing on its own is a whole other task. So that is a big part of why our videos are so chaotic and maybe not as coherent as people would like, is because we are autistic and disabled, and we're not interested in changing the stuff in our videos too much, because we want people to know that this is how we are, this is how we exist as autistic people. So yeah, that's that.
Yeah, so that's kind of how just some of the ways that it impacts our videos, but some of the ways that just burnout has impacted us. For one, we're both currently unemployed right now, so that's one way that it's impacted us. I know for me, just small talk has always been hard, but it's a lot harder now. My burnout really kicked in a couple years ago, once I was in university. That's really when it kicks in for a lot of people, especially if you've been undiagnosed, because you've been masking so hard that by the time you get off to university, it can catch up to a lot of people, and that's...
Yeah, and specifically the non-structured university. So high school is much more every hour is structured kind of thing, and you're still living at home presumably for the most part, and there's a lot more external forms of scheduling, and once you get to university it's pretty much all on you, and yeah, that's where I imploded.
Yeah, university was so hard for that, and I remember getting to, I think third year was when it really started to hit, because that was when I started volunteering on campus more and started getting more involved with my special interests. So something that's also made burnout a lot harder for me is that one of my main special interests is social justice. And when I was doing that work, it could be really exhausting. When you're working in marginalized communities, especially ones that you're a part of, and you're dealing with homophobia and transphobia on a daily basis, and I was teaching stuff to staff and faculty, and I was having a lot of really difficult conversations, and then just doing all these different things, and both of my programs were also focused on social justice, so literally everything I was taking in was very depressing at times, and very hard and very triggering, and very very much things that I was also living on a daily basis. And it's really hard to explain to people what it's like to have a special interest that is energizing but also draining, because a lot of people would just tell me to quit. They're like, oh, well, if it's so tiring, then just stop doing it. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. Because it's like, for one, like, it's a special interest. Like, I want to be doing social justice stuff. This is what I love to do. This is what I love to talk about. Like, I could go and talk about it for hours. Like, that's what I enjoy. But also, like, I'm a queer, trans, disabled person. Like, I can't just choose to stop caring and about it. Like,
yeah, the stuff comes home with you after work.
Yeah.
A lot of your other coworkers, like when you were working it, their coworkers were mostly people that didn't have many intersections of oppression, and so they could go home and separate themselves emotionally, compartmentalize, I think is the word.
Yeah. Yeah, and like for me, like most of the jobs that I had up until last year were within marginalized communities. Like, I had worked at a few different like LGBTQ plus nonprofits and like similar style environments where I was working with other queer people, other trans people. Like, I was within my own community doing this work. But the last job that I was at, it was like, it was so different because I like wasn't allowed to do the work that I had been doing, and like I was working at the university, and it was just very much like working within the system, and it was just very hard on me.
Yeah, and that was especially like it bled into your life outside of work as well, because in the contract they told you that you couldn't talk about like political stuff on your social media and stuff, which not only took away your special interest in a working environment, because you weren't working in anything to do with like queer stuff anymore.
It was
but then you went home and you weren't even allowed to go to rallies or whatever. Yeah, like,
no, it was so frustrating. Like, I literally, like, I'll probably talk about this more in other videos, but I worked for a student association last year. I'm not going to get into like which one it was or like more details on that, but I had campaigned on a lot of equity-based issues. Like, my campaign was very social justice oriented because that's a lot of the work that I was interested in. That's what I was hoping to do, and pretty much I got in and I wasn't able to do a lot of things that I wanted, and it just really sucked. And like, yeah, just like as Erebus mentioned, like, as with it being my special interest on top of everything, like, was just like my brain was just not having it.
Yeah, and I think that if you, because at the time they hadn't realized they were autistic yet. All of this is stuff that we've realized in hindsight, because it was obviously like it was pretty obvious that you're not being able to be involved in social justice stuff was difficult, but we didn't understand why it was so difficult, why it was like such a huge impact on your mental health.
Yeah, like it literally felt soul crushing. Yeah. Like, I was literally told like I wasn't allowed to go to any like protests or rallies on my own free time. Yeah. Like, and it was just so unbelievably frustrating. Like, not being able to engage in community events that were so important to me. And not be able to like info dump about the stuff that I wanted to, because I didn't really feel safe to do that. And it was just like a whole combination of things. Yeah. And what about you? What has your burnout been like?
As with everything else, the concussions confused burnout stuff a lot too. For just clarity, the concussion timeline, had my first concussion my first diagnosed concussion when I was 12, after a car accident, and then 2 in high school, both when I was 16. The second one when I was 16 was like really bad, and then I went and had to take a I had to take a gap year. I had to defer university for a year because I was in senior year at that point. And that was like, they were like, yeah, so worst case scenario, you'll have to defer a year and wait for your brain to heal a little bit more. And so that was like, I was back on timeline kind of thing, and then I went to school, and like, I don't know, I feel like for me, the like timeline of the expectations of schooling kind of messed with my brain recovery, because like even while I was in the gap year when I was supposed to be healing my brain, like I was going to tutoring multiple times a week to like catch up on shit that I'd missed in high school because I'd been concussed. So like I wasn't even taking a break during my like gap year that was supposed to be a break, then that would then prepare me for university. So pretty predictably I went into university and I was like pretty consistently barely keeping my head above water, like barely passing all my classes, very much struggling. Hello. Oh Jesus, what was I saying? You're real interference. Okay. The constant theme of barely keeping my head above water, that started during the concussion recovery, because that was like at the point when they were like, hey, you need to take a gap year, was because I wasn't healing as quickly as I should be, so I was not doing okay, and then I took the gap year in order to be okay, and I didn't realize that I wasn't okay. I was like, yeah, sure, it's been a year, I'm probably fine, right? But what essentially happened was that I emerged from the like normal concussion recovery period, like after going through like all the different avenues of medical care that I was supposed to, and I just still had a bunch of the symptoms, like they hadn't changed at all, and it was like the sensory overload, panic attacks because of the sensory overload, what else was it? It was constant fatigue. I, like in high school, at the end of high school, I was like all of a sudden having to sleep 10 plus hours every night, otherwise I literally couldn't function with my poor concussed brain, and that hasn't really changed. Like I've still been exhausted my entire life since then, and I think, yeah, oh my god, I'm having such a hard time.
It's the burnout.
It's the burnout. Yeah, I have a really, really hard time differentiating like concussion stuff from burnout stuff. Partially because they're similar symptoms, but also because for so long everyone around me was just telling me that it was only the concussions. And I now know that that's not true, because like I have fully recovered from the concussions. Like there's no way that I haven't at this point. And like, yeah, all the symptoms are still here. And the more we were doing research on autism stuff, the more it became obvious that these are just symptoms of burnout that have transferred. And like, I don't know if there was ever a point that I wasn't burnt out.
Yeah.
Because like I just went straight from concussed mode, and then at some point during that probably got burnt out because I was dealing with a brain injury at the same time, and then just emerged out of it already burnt out. So like I never had a fucking chance. Yeah, and so for a while I thought that I just hadn't recovered from the concussions. Like that was up until very recently. Like my mom is still convinced that the concussions are the only thing wrong in my life, which is really funny. But like I'd be going to the same, like my mom would find a different physiotherapist, and I'd go and they'd be like, oh yeah, we can definitely help you get this like last little bit of concussion fixed. And then I'd do the physiotherapy, and then I would still be like dealing with sensory overload and still be...
Like the appointment themselves would be putting you in sensory overload.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
they'd be making you do so many like tasks and like beeping things and just all of these things that literally just trigger sensory overload for an autistic person.
Yeah.
Like all the activities that they were doing to train your brain.
And it's like these things are the right thing to do when you are concussed, when the concussion is the only thing causing the issue. But like, that's clearly not what's been happening. Yeah. Yeah, so like pretty much after I recovered from the concussions, everyone in my life was like, yep, you're good to go to university, go off and do things. And it was just a constant up and down of like trying to get back into school, and then something would happen and then I'd like have to take a break, and then my parents would push me to go back, and then I'd like break down again, or like in second year I'd get another concussion, and then
And like we were talking about before, like the concussions.
Year, I had a like really, really crippling anxiety phase where I literally was starving because I couldn't keep food down. Yeah.
Yeah, like we were mentioning earlier, we were talking before we started filming that the times when you had a lot of your head injuries were when you were really burnt out. And like one of the big symptoms of our autistic burnout a lot of the time is like clumsiness and like bumping into things.
What's it called? It's
motor
spatial
skills?
awareness.
Spatial
awareness and proprioception are both knocked down, which is another thing. Proprioception. Yeah, so proprioception is your brain's capacity to know where the rest of your body is without the visual cue, and that's one of the reasons, like, I hit my head on a bus, which was my most recent concussion, which would have been completely avoidable for a neurotypical person, because they would have been like, oh, when I'm walking this way, at this point I need to duck my head. But I just, like, didn't realize where my head was, so I walked head first into this thing.
And that was literally the morning after Pride weekend. So we'd spent the entire weekend in massive crowds of people with loud noises and bright lights and a lot of commotion.
Yeah.
So
it makes sense that my, like, clumsiness was heightened at that point. And then that just opened me up to be more likely to get another concussion, and then, yeah. It's a never-ending cycle of things that don't mix well together.
Yeah.
Being concussed and having autism, it's just double sensory overload. But yeah, I wish I knew where I was going with this. When we first were filming this, we had a memory card issue. Yeah, so like my experience with burnout, again, I thought it was concussion stuff most of the time. And so a lot of the time I went back to like school or work way too soon. Because all my doctors were telling me that the concussion timeline was clear. But I should have been focusing on how I was actually feeling. And I wasn't feeling good. So yeah.
I think also because there was such a focus on the concussion that there was this idea of like healing and like a finished end result of like curing the symptoms.
Yeah.
And how that's made it harder up until like at least this point of like even understanding that you were dealing with burnout and that this was going to be something that would like you would
probably
have to continue
for
with
a little while.
For a while, and that might come back again in the future, unlike brain issues where like you think that you're just going to heal it.
Yeah, I think the key difference is that if you're having residual symptoms from a brain injury, they're probably going to get you to do repetitive exercises for whatever aspect of your brain isn't working as well. But if all I'm experiencing is autistic burnout, then doing those repetitive exercises are just gonna, it's gonna do is overstimulate that part of my brain, and it's not gonna help. It's gonna make me more exhausted. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not fun getting misdiagnosed.
Yeah. And like for me, I only really started understanding my own autism and like ADHD and OCD and stuff within quarantine, within lockdown. So it's been really interesting that most of my memories of like the world outside of the pandemic have been entirely me masking and like being completely undiagnosed, thinking that I was an able-bodied neurotypical woman. Like that's what my world was before quarantine happened, which is wild.
Yeah.
Like my expectations for myself were so high, and like those things just weren't realistic for me because like I was holding myself to such a high expectation of like productivity that's just not sustainable for my body mind, like at all. Yeah. So it's been really interesting being in lockdown because I like haven't had to interact with people as much, so it's been nice.
And even
in
within
some...
those interactions, they've been very different. Like having a physical mask on your face.
Yeah.
Oddly enough,
helps
saves you from
less.
masking.
Yeah.
At least that chunk of your face, which is nice. Yeah, oh my god, I haven't had one person ask me if I'm okay in the past year, just because my facial expression wasn't what they're expecting it to be. Wow, I didn't realize that's really funny.
Yeah, that's really funny.
Yeah, and then obviously just the whole social side of it in terms of like, it's much more socially acceptable for people to be unemployed and not in school right now. So like, my reasons for being unemployed and not in school are mostly not to do with the pandemic, but it has made it a lot easier when people do ask what I'm up to, and I'm like, yep, I'm not doing good. And they're like, oh yeah, the pandemic, and I'm like,
yeah, that's
that
the reason.
too.
Yep.
Yeah. But then on the flip side, there are, I'm sure, millions of autistic people experiencing burnout that because of the pandemic aren't able to get the support they need, aren't able to do the same coping mechanisms they're used to, especially if that relies on like physical support. Like, it's hard to social distance with friends if like what you need most is like a hug.
Yeah. And like, I've even seen a lot of people talking about the difficulties of not being able to info dump and like not being able to share about their special interests and how difficult that is. Like, we're really lucky that like we live together and we have each other and like the cats to talk to.
Yeah, honestly, I was just gonna say, and our cats too. I info dump to our cats all the time.
Yeah. Like, living alone, like if you're living alone, it must be, I can't even imagine how difficult it would be to not be able to like talk and share about special interests and stuff, because that's just such a huge thing for so many people. Like, there's so many different ways that lockdown has been impacting people. Yeah, I'm curious to hear like how has being in like lockdown impacted you? Are like there any positive things that have happened? Like just getting like away from people in certain ways, like what things have been positive, what things have just been like different or hard for you. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what y'all have to say.
Yeah. For me, I think I've been a lot kinder to myself during lockdown.
Yeah.
In terms of like expectations, especially. Like if I'm planning what I'm gonna do for the day and I know we need to make a quick grocery trip or whatever, I'll be like, you know what, I'm gonna focus on that being the main big task of the day, because I know that grocery stores are a very, very sensory overloading environment for me and for Autumn.
Yeah. Especially
so
more so
if
now.
we're
yeah,
if we're gonna be doing a designated grocery trip, we need to plan the rest of our day around like the blowback that's gonna happen after having been in a grocery store.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I didn't factor in a lot in the past, partially out of stubbornness and partially out of like internalized ableism of being like, no, you should be able to get through multiple tasks a day. But no, with the pandemic, I feel like it's been a lot easier to break down like simple household tasks into like days of the week and spread them out so that I don't overload myself and then not want to talk to anyone for a couple days.
Yeah.
That's my biggest piece of advice, is just like stop putting so much stake in expectations of yourself and just let yourself exist. 'Cause existing is hard, even when you don't have unnecessary pressures put on you, let alone unnecessary pressures from yourself. Like that's just too much. So try your best to be kind to yourself.
So our next week's video will be talking about polyamory and our experiences being in an ethically non-monogamous relationship and what that's just generally been for us as queer, disabled, autistic people.
We are really excited to talk about our relationship and answer some questions from you. So feel free to comment below or message us on our socials. We will include all of this in the description below.
And as always, like and subscribe to stay updated.
Bye. Or see you next time. There's a script in front of me. I should have been able to see you next time. Bye.
Bye.